In the early 20th century, a simple infection could be a death sentence. Cuts, wounds, and minor illnesses that seem manageable today often led to severe complications, spreading through the body with little resistance. Hospitals, despite their growing knowledge, had limited tools to stop bacterial infections. Doctors could clean wounds, perform surgeries, and try various treatments. But once harmful bacteria began to spread, there was often very little they could do. The microscopic world of bacteria remained one of the greatest threats to human life. It was within this fragile and uncertain medical landscape that a quiet and observant scientist made a discovery that would change the course of medicine forever. His name was Alexander Fleming. Alexander Fleming was born in 1881 in rural Scotland, in a setting far removed from laboratories and scientific institutions. His early life was shaped by simplicity, discipline, and close observation of the natural world. Growing up in the countryside, he developed a practical mindset and an awareness of how small details could have larger consequences. This habit of noticing subtle changes would later play a crucial role in his scientific work. Fleming did not begin his career with the clear intention of becoming a groundbreaking scientist. After moving to London, he initially worked in an office setting, but his path shifted when he enrolled in medical school at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School. There, he trained as a doctor and developed an interest in bacteriology, the study of bacteria. At the time, this field was still developing, with scientists working to understand how microscopic organisms cause disease and how they might be controlled. Fleming came under the influence of Wright, a leading researcher in immunology. Wright's work focused on the body's natural defenses against infection, particularly the role of the immune system in fighting bacteria. Under his guidance, Fleming began studying how the body responds to infection and how certain substances might help or hinder this process. This early exposure shaped Fleming's thinking, leading him to approach medicine with a focus on both observation and experimentation. During the First World War, Fleming served as a medical officer. This experience had a profound impact on him. He witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of infected wounds on soldiers. Even when injuries were not immediately fatal, infections often developed, leading to severe complications and death. The antiseptics used at the time, while intended to kill bacteria, sometimes caused additional damage to human tissue, making recovery even more difficult. This left a lasting impression. Fleming became increasingly aware that existing treatments were not sufficient. There was a need for methods that could target harmful bacteria without harming the patient. This idea would stay with him, guiding his later research. After the war, Fleming returned to his work at St. Mary's, continuing his studies on bacteria and the body's defenses. He made several contributions during this period, including the discovery of an enzyme called lysozyme. This substance, found in bodily fluids such as tears and saliva, could break down certain types of bacteria. Although lysozyme was not effective against all harmful bacteria, it demonstrated that natural substances could have antibacterial properties. This discovery reinforced an important idea. There might be ways to fight infection using agents that work with the body rather than against it. Fleming's laboratory work was characterized by a combination of careful observation and a somewhat unconventional approach to organization. Unlike some scientists who maintained highly controlled and orderly workspaces, Fleming's lab was known for being less structured. Petri dishes, cultures, and experimental materials were often left for extended periods, allowing unexpected changes to occur. It was within this environment that one of the most important moments in medical history took place. In 1928, Fleming was studying cultures of Staphylococcus bacteria, a common cause of infections. Before leaving for a short break, he left several Petri dishes in his laboratory. When he returned, he began examining them, as he often did, looking for any unusual developments. On one of the dishes, something caught his attention. A mold had grown on the surface, likely introduced by accident from the surrounding environment. At first glance, this might have seemed like contamination, something to be discarded. But Fleming noticed something unusual. Around the mold, the bacteria had been destroyed. There was a clear area where the bacterial growth had been inhibited, while elsewhere on the dish, the bacteria continued to grow normally. This contrast was striking. The mold appeared to be producing a substance that prevented the bacteria from surviving. Many scientists might have overlooked this. Fleming did not. He recognized that this unexpected result could be significant. Instead of discarding the contaminated dish, he began investigating it further. He identified the mold as belonging to the Penicillium group and started studying the substance it produced. He named this substance penicillin. At the time, Fleming understood that penicillin had strong antibacterial properties. It could kill certain types of bacteria without harming human cells, making it potentially useful as a treatment for infections. However, turning this observation into a practical medicine was not straightforward. Penicillin was difficult to isolate and produce in large quantities. Fleming's initial work demonstrated its potential, but he did not have the resources or techniques needed to develop it into a widely usable drug. As a result, his discovery, while important, did not immediately transform medicine. For several years, it remained largely overlooked. Yet the significance of what Fleming had found would eventually become clear. The mold growing accidentally on a petri dish had revealed a powerful natural defense against bacterial infection. And in that quiet moment of observation, Alexander Fleming had opened the door to one of the most important medical breakthroughs in human history. After Alexander, Fleming identified the antibacterial properties of the Penicillium mold. The significance of his observation slowly began to take shape, though not with immediate impact. In his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital, Fleming continued to study the substance he had named penicillin, carefully testing its effects on different types of bacteria. His results were clear. Penicillin was capable of destroying many harmful bacteria while leaving human cells largely unaffected. This was exactly the kind of selective action that doctors had long hoped for, a way to target infection without damaging the body itself. Yet despite this promise, penicillin did not quickly become a medical breakthrough. The challenge was not in recognizing its potential, but in making it usable. The substance produced by the mold was unstable and difficult to extract in pure form. It degraded easily, losing its effectiveness before it could be properly studied or applied. Fleming worked with the tools and techniques available to him, but they were not sufficient to solve this problem. His laboratory, though active and productive, was not equipped for the large-scale chemical work needed to transform penicillin into a practical treatment. As a result, his discovery remained in a kind of quiet state. He published his findings in 1929, describing the antibacterial properties of penicillin and suggesting its possible medical use. The paper was clear and scientifically sound, but it did not attract widespread attention. At the time, many researchers were focused on other approaches to fighting infection, including the development of chemical antiseptics and early antibacterial drugs. Penicillin, in its unstable and difficult to produce form, seemed more like an interesting observation than an immediate solution. Fleming himself did not abandon the idea, but neither did he have the means to push it further. For nearly a decade, penicillin remained largely in the background of scientific research. It was known, documented, and understood in principle, but not developed. This period is an important part of the story because it shows how discovery alone is not always enough. Scientific progress often depends not only on insight, but also on timing, resources, and the ability to connect ideas with practical methods. The turning point came in the late 1930s, when a group of scientists at the University of Oxford began to revisit Fleming's work. Howard Florey, Ernst Borschain, and their colleagues recognized that penicillin might hold the key to treating bacterial infections in a way that had not yet been achieved. They approached the problem from a different angle, combining biological understanding with advanced chemical techniques. Their goal was not simply to observe penicillin's effects, but to isolate it, stabilize it, and produce it in a form that could be used in medicine. This was a difficult and demanding task. The team had to develop new methods for growing the mold, extracting the active substance, and purifying it without destroying its effectiveness. Early experiments were slow and labor-intensive. Small amounts of penicillin were produced, carefully collected, and tested. Despite the challenges, the results were promising. Penicillin retained its ability to kill bacteria, and when used in controlled conditions, it showed clear potential as a treatment. As the work progressed, the urgency of the situation began to increase. The world was moving toward another major conflict. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the need for effective treatments for infected wounds became critical. Soldiers injured in battle were at high risk of infection, and existing treatments were often insufficient. The possibility of a drug that could reliably combat bacterial infections was no longer just a scientific goal, but a practical necessity. The Oxford team pushed forward with determination. They conducted experiments on animals, demonstrating that penicillin could successfully treat infections without causing harm. These results provided strong evidence that the substance could be used safely in humans. The next step was to test it in clinical settings, a process that required both courage and careful planning. The first human trials took place under difficult conditions. Penicillin was still extremely scarce, produced only in small quantities through complex processes. Even so, the results were remarkable. Patients suffering from severe bacterial infections showed significant improvement after receiving penicillin. In cases where other treatments had failed, this new substance was able to stop the spread of infection and support recovery. However, the limited supply remained a major obstacle. At one point, the available penicillin was so scarce that doctors had to collect and reuse it from patients' urine, attempting to recover as much of the substance as possible. This situation highlighted both the potential of penicillin and the urgent need for large-scale production. Efforts soon expanded beyond the laboratory. Scientists, governments, and industries began working together to find ways to produce penicillin in much larger quantities. This required new methods of fermentation, improved techniques for extraction and purification, and coordination across different fields. The process was complex, but the importance of the goal drove rapid progress. By the early 1940s, production had begun to increase. Penicillin started to move from experimental use into broader medical application. It was used to treat wounded soldiers, reducing death from infection and improving recovery rates. What had once been a mold growing accidentally on a petri dish was becoming one of the most powerful tools in medicine. Throughout this period, Fleming's original discovery remained at the center of the story. Although he had not solved the problem of large-scale production, his observation had provided the foundation. Without his careful attention to an unexpected detail, the entire chain of events that followed might never have begun. The development of penicillin was not the work of a single individual. It was the result of observation, persistence, collaboration, and the ability to build on earlier ideas. Fleming's role was to see what others might have ignored, to recognize significance in something small and accidental. And from that moment of observation, a path had been set that would soon transform medicine and save millions of lives. As penicillin moved from laboratory curiosity to a viable medical treatment, the scale of the challenge shifted dramatically. It was no longer enough to prove that the substance worked. The world now needed it in quantities large enough to make a real difference. What began as a scientific breakthrough had turned into an industrial and logistical problem, one that required coordination across countries, institutions, and entire industries. During the early 1940s, the urgency of this effort intensified under the pressure of the Second World War. Infections remained one of the leading causes of death among wounded soldiers. Even relatively minor injuries could become life-threatening if bacteria spread through the body. The introduction of penicillin offered a solution unlike anything that had come before, but only if it could be produced on a massive scale. Small laboratory batches were no longer sufficient. What was needed was a reliable and continuous supply. The responsibility for this transformation fell on a combination of scientists, engineers, and manufacturers. In the United States and the United Kingdom, large-scale programs were launched to develop new methods of production. Researchers experimented with different strains of Penicillium mold, searching for those that produced higher yields of penicillin. At the same time, They worked to improve the conditions under which the mold was grown, adjusting temperature, nutrients, and fermentation techniques to maximize output. One of the key breakthroughs came from the use of deep fermentation. Instead of growing the mold on the surface of shallow containers, scientists developed methods to cultivate it in large tanks filled with nutrient-rich liquid. This approach allowed for much greater production, as the mold could grow throughout the entire volume rather than just on the surface. It also made the process more controllable, enabling consistent results across large batches. Even with these advances, the work was far from simple. Penicillin remained a delicate substance, sensitive to heat and environmental conditions. Extracting it from the fermentation mixture required careful chemical processes to separate it from other materials without destroying its effectiveness. Teams worked continuously to refine these methods, improving efficiency and reducing waste. At the same time, researchers discovered more productive strains of the mold. One well-known example involved a strain found on a piece of moldy fruit, which produced significantly higher amounts of penicillin than earlier versions. This discovery, like Fleming's original observation, showed how chance and careful attention could combine to produce major advances. By selecting and cultivating these more efficient strains, production increased rapidly. By 1944, penicillin was being produced in quantities large enough to supply military operations. It was used extensively during the D-Day invasion, where it played a crucial role in treating wounded soldiers. Infections that would once have led to severe complications or death could now be controlled. Recovery rates improved, and the survival of injured soldiers increased significantly. The impact was immediate and measurable. Doctors who had once struggled against uncontrollable infections now had a tool that could directly target the bacteria causing disease. Conditions such as septic wounds, pneumonia, and blood infections became far more manageable. The introduction of penicillin marked the beginning of a new era in medicine, where bacterial infections were no longer among the most feared and uncontrollable threats. After the war, the production of penicillin continued to expand. What had been developed under the pressure of wartime necessity was adapted for civilian use. Hospitals began using penicillin to treat a wide range of infections, from common illnesses to life-threatening conditions. The drug became more widely available, and its use spread across the world. This transformation changed everyday life. Infections that had once required long and uncertain treatments could now be addressed quickly and effectively. Surgical procedures became safer, as the risk of post-operative infection was greatly reduced. Diseases that had once been major causes of death began to decline in severity and frequency. At the same time, the success of penicillin led to further research. Scientists began searching for other antibiotics, substances that could target different types of bacteria or work in different ways. This effort led to the discovery of additional drugs, expanding the range of treatments available and strengthening the ability of medicine to control infectious disease. Throughout this period, Alexander Fleming's role was increasingly recognized. Although the large-scale development of penicillin involved many contributors, Fleming's original discovery remained the starting point. He was acknowledged for his insight in recognizing the importance of the mold and for his early work in demonstrating its antibacterial properties. In 1945, Fleming was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, shared with Howard Florey and Ernst Chain. This recognition reflected the collaborative nature of the achievement. Fleming had discovered penicillin, while Florey and Chain had developed it into a practical treatment. Together, their work represented one of the most important advances in the history of medicine. Despite the recognition, Fleming remained modest. He often emphasized that his discovery had been partly accidental, the result of careful observation rather than deliberate design. Yet it was precisely this ability to notice and investigate the unexpected that made his contribution so significant. Many others might have overlooked the contaminated petri dish, seeing it as a failed experiment rather than a breakthrough. Fleming also understood that penicillin was not a complete solution. He warned that improper use of antibiotics could lead to resistance, where bacteria adapt and become less affected by treatment. This concern would later become a major issue in medicine, showing that even the most powerful discoveries come with limitations and responsibilities. By the mid-20th century, penicillin had become a symbol of scientific progress. It demonstrated how a small observation, combined with sustained effort and collaboration, could lead to changes that affect millions of lives. The world before antibiotics had been defined by uncertainty and vulnerability to infection. The world after penicillin was one where many of those threats could be controlled. What had once been invisible and uncontrollable had become something that could be understood, targeted, and treated. And at the center of that transformation was the quiet moment when Alexander Fleming chose to look more closely at something others might have ignored. As the decades moved forward, the full impact of Alexander Fleming's discovery continued to expand, reaching far beyond the laboratories and hospitals where penicillin had first been developed. What began as a single observation in 1928 had grown into a cornerstone of modern medicine, fundamentally changing how humanity deals with infection, disease, and recovery. The introduction of antibiotics did not simply improve treatment. It reshaped expectations of survival, turning many once fatal conditions into manageable and often temporary illnesses. By the mid-20th century, penicillin had become widely available across much of the world. Hospitals began to integrate it into routine care, using it to treat infections that had previously required long periods of uncertainty. Pneumonia, blood infections, and complications from injuries could now be addressed with a level of confidence that had not existed before. The fear that once surrounded even minor wounds began to diminish, replaced by a growing trust in the power of medical treatment. Surgery itself was transformed. Before antibiotics, even successful operations carried a high risk of infection during recovery. Surgeons had to work with extreme caution, knowing that bacteria could undo their efforts. With the availability of penicillin, this risk was significantly reduced. More complex procedures became possible, and recovery rates improved. Medicine entered a new phase, one in which intervention was not only more precise, but also more reliable. The influence of penicillin also extended into everyday life. Infections that once spread easily through communities could now be treated quickly, reducing both severity and transmission. Childhood illnesses, workplace injuries, and common bacterial diseases became less threatening. Life expectancy began to rise, supported in part by the ability to control infections that had previously taken many lives. Yet even as penicillin brought these changes, it also revealed new challenges. Fleming himself had warned about the potential for misuse. He understood that bacteria are not static, that they can adapt to their environment. If antibiotics were used carelessly or in insufficient doses, some bacteria might survive and develop resistance. Over time, these resistant strains could become more difficult to treat, reducing the effectiveness of the very drugs that had once been so powerful. This concern would gradually become a reality. As antibiotics were used more widely, cases of resistance began to appear. Some bacteria evolved mechanisms to survive exposure to penicillin, requiring new treatments and more advanced drugs. This ongoing process highlighted a deeper truth about medicine. Progress is not a final state, but a continuous effort, requiring adaptation and careful use of knowledge. Even with these challenges, the legacy of Fleming's discovery remained profound. Penicillin opened the door to the development of an entire class of antibiotics. Scientists built upon this foundation, discovering new substances capable of targeting different types of bacteria. Each new drug expanded the ability of medicine to respond to infection, creating a network of treatments that could be adapted to different conditions. Fleming's role in this transformation was widely recognized. He became a symbol of scientific insight, representing the importance of observation and curiosity. His story was often told as an example of how major discoveries can arise from unexpected moments. provided someone is willing to pay attention. Despite the global recognition he received, Fleming remained consistent in his outlook, emphasizing that his work was part of a larger effort rather than an isolated achievement. He continued his research and remained connected to the scientific community, contributing to discussions about medicine and public health. His perspective was shaped not only by his discovery, but also by his earlier experiences during the First World War, where he had seen the devastating effects of untreated infections. These experiences gave him a lasting awareness of the human impact of scientific progress, reminding him that each advancement carried real consequences for people's lives. Alexander Fleming died in 1955, leaving behind a world that had been fundamentally changed by his work. The difference between the world of his early career and the world at the time of his death was striking. What had once been a medical landscape defined by limited options and high risk had become one where infections could often be controlled and treated effectively. This transformation did not eliminate disease, but it shifted the balance, giving humanity a powerful tool in the ongoing effort to preserve health. Today, the impact of penicillin is still felt. It remains one of the most important discoveries in medical history, a turning point that marked the beginning of the antibiotic era. The principles behind it continue to guide research, influencing how new drugs are developed and how existing ones are used. At the same time, the challenges of resistance remind us that even the most successful discoveries require ongoing care and responsibility. Fleming's story reflects a pattern that appears throughout science. A small observation leads to a question. That question leads to investigation. And through persistence and collaboration, a solution emerges that reshapes understanding. In this case, the observation was a mold growing on a forgotten petri dish. The question was why bacteria could not grow around it. The answer became a discovery that changed the course of medicine. The quiet moment in Fleming's laboratory did not appear extraordinary at the time. There were no dramatic events, no immediate recognition of its importance. Yet within that moment was the beginning of a transformation that would reach across decades and continents, influencing the lives of millions. Through careful observation, patience, and a willingness to explore the unexpected, Alexander Fleming revealed that even the smallest details can hold the power to change the world. And in doing so, he helped turn the fight against infection from a struggle defined by limitation into one guided by knowledge, precision, and hope.